Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time and myth, to a world where empires collided and destiny wore the face of a woman. Tonight, we travel back over 2,000 years to the golden shores of the Nile, where marble palaces gleamed under the Mediterranean sun, where gods walked among mortals, and where one queen dared to stand between Rome and eternity. This is the story of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt. A tale of ambition and survival, of love and war, of a kingdom 3 millennia old dying in the arms of its final ruler. So settle in, take a breath, and let me take you back to ancient Alexandria, where history and legend become one. Before we meet Cleopatra, we must understand what she inherited. Egypt was not just a kingdom. It was a living, breathing testament to human endurance, a civilization so ancient that by Cleopatra's time, the pyramids were already older to her than she is to us. For over 3,000 years, Egypt had risen with the sun and slept beneath the stars, its heartbeat synchronized with the flooding of the Nile, that great dark river that brought life to the desert every single year without fail. The Nile was everything. It was clock and calendar, highway and breadbasket, the boundary between life and death, between the black fertile soil and the red wasteland beyond. Egyptian farmers measured their year not by distant kings or abstract numbers, but by the river's rhythm. Flooding season, growing season, harvest season, an eternal cycle as reliable as breath. When the dog star Sirius rose before dawn, the Egyptians knew the floods would come, and with them, another year of life. And from that life, from that black earth, rose something extraordinary. Temples that touched the sky, tombs carved deep into stone, obelisks that pierced the heavens like frozen lightning. The Egyptians built not for decades but for eternity. They believed in a world beyond this one, vivid and orderly, where the blessed dead would sail with Ra across the sky forever. Death was not an ending. It was a transformation, a doorway, a second life that required preparation, magic, and memory. At the center of this cosmic order stood the Pharaoh. Not merely a king, but a god in human form, the living Horus, the son of Ra, the keeper of Ma'at, that sacred principle of truth, justice, and cosmic balance. The Pharaoh's word upheld order. His presence kept chaos at bay. His rituals fed the gods. Even the crown he wore, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, spoke of divine union, of a land made whole by sacred kingship. For thousands of years, native Egyptians had worn that crown. Dynasties rose and fell, but the blood remained Egyptian, the language remained Egyptian, the gods remained constant. The world seemed eternal, unchanging, protected by desert and divinity alike. But eternity, as it turned out, could be conquered, and it was conquered not by an army, but by a single man with golden hair and impossible ambition. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great swept into Egypt like a desert storm. But he came not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. The Persians, who had ruled Egypt as distant overlords, were driven out, and the Egyptians, weary of foreign masters who neither knew their language nor honored their gods, welcomed Alexander with open arms. He was young, brilliant, and understood the power of theater. He traveled to the oracle of Amun at Siwa, deep in the western desert, and there the priests proclaimed him divine, the son of Amun-Ra, a god made flesh. Alexander did not just conquer Egypt, he became Egypt. And then he did something that would echo through centuries. He founded a city, not in the ancient capitals of Thebes or Memphis, but on the Mediterranean coast, a gleaming Hellenistic jewel called Alexandria. Wide boulevards, marble colonnades, a lighthouse that would become one of the wonders of the world, and a library. Oh, that magnificent library, designed to gather all human knowledge under one roof. Alexandria was not Egyptian. It was something new, a fusion of Greek intellect and Egyptian mysticism, a bridge between civilizations. But Alexander would not live to see his city bloom. Within a decade, he was dead, struck down by fever in distant Babylon, leaving behind an empire too vast for any one person to hold. His generals tore it apart like wolves over a carcass, each claiming their piece of conquered earth. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's bodyguards, a man of shrewd intelligence and patient ambition. While others fought for glory, Ptolemy sailed to Egypt and made it his. He even stole Alexander's body, hijacking the funeral procession meant to carry it home to Macedonia, and buried it instead in Alexandria, a political masterstroke that made Egypt the eternal resting place of the god-king. From that act rose a dynasty, the Ptolemies, foreign kings who would rule Egypt for 300 years. They were Macedonian by blood, Greek by culture, but they dressed themselves in Egyptian tradition like actors in a play. They built temples to Isis and Osiris, called themselves pharaohs, performed ancient rituals, and even married their own siblings, as the old pharaohs had done, to keep the bloodline pure and present themselves as divine. But beneath the golden mask, they remained outsiders, Greek-speaking monarchs ruling a land whose language they would not learn, whose people they never quite understood. The first Ptolemies were strong. They built, they traded, they kept Egypt wealthy and stable. But as generations passed, the dynasty turned inward, suspicious, paranoid. The royal court became a nest of vipers. Brothers killed sisters, mothers poisoned sons, lovers betrayed lovers. The crown passed from hand to bloody hand, and all the while, across the Mediterranean, a new power was rising. Rome, hungry and relentless, watched Egypt's wealth with covetous eyes. By the time Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE, the Ptolemaic dynasty was a shadow of its former glory. Her father, Ptolemy XII, called himself the new Dionysus, but the people called him Oletes, the flute player, a weak king who danced to Rome's tune. He had been driven from his throne by his own people and bought his way back with Roman gold, draining Egypt's treasury to purchase legions and senatorial favor. He died in 51 BCE, leaving behind not a stable kingdom, but a trembling inheritance, split between his 18-year-old daughter Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII. They were married, as custom demanded, king and queen. But one was a woman, grown, educated, brilliant, and ambitious. The other was a child, surrounded by advisors with their own agendas. From the very beginning, the throne tilted dangerously. Cleopatra ruled with her brother in name only. She appeared alone on coins, conducted diplomacy in her own voice, and did something revolutionary, something no Ptolemy had done in 3 centuries. She learned Egyptian. She spoke to priests in their own language, read hieroglyphs, participated in sacred rituals, not as a performer, but with genuine understanding. The people noticed. The temples noticed. But so did her brother's court. Within 3 years, the tension erupted. Cleopatra was pushed from power, exiled from Alexandria, forced to flee into the eastern deserts, while her brother's guardian seized control. She gathered an army, loyal followers, but swords alone would not be enough. What she needed was an ally, a powerful ally. And fate, wearing Roman armor, was already sailing toward Egypt. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BCE, not to settle Egyptian disputes, but chasing his enemy Pompey, a rival Roman general fleeing defeat. But when Caesar came ashore, Pompey was already dead, beheaded by Ptolemy's advisors as a gift to curry favor with Rome's rising star. Caesar was not pleased. He saw not loyalty, but presumption, a child king meddling in Roman affairs. And so he stayed in Alexandria, claiming to mediate the dispute between the siblings, but really consolidating power for himself. And then Cleopatra made her legendary move. Under cover of darkness, she was smuggled into Caesar's quarters. The story, perhaps embellished by time, says she was rolled up in a carpet or hidden in a linen sack, delivered to the Roman general like treasure. When she emerged before him, Caesar saw not just a desperate queen, but brilliance, courage, and possibility. She spoke Latin. She spoke of politics, of Egypt's wealth, of her father's friendship with Rome. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was fascinating. And Caesar, that cold, calculating conqueror, was captivated. By morning, everything had changed. Caesar declared Cleopatra the rightful queen. Roman legions backed her claim. Civil war erupted in Alexandria. Ptolemy XIII fled the city and drowned in the Nile, his golden diadem found tangled in the reeds like discarded trash. Cleopatra was restored, not by Egyptian might, but by Roman steel. She was queen again. But the price was clear. Egypt's independence was an illusion, carefully maintained for now, but fragile as papyrus. What began as political alliance became something more. Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers, openly, scandalously. They sailed together down the Nile, past temples that predated Rome itself, a floating procession of power and promise. And from that union came a son, born in 47 BCE, named Ptolemy XV, but called Caesarion, Little Caesar. His birth was more than personal. It was a declaration. Here was the bridge between Rome and Egypt, between West and East, the child of two empires. Cleopatra followed Caesar to Rome, bringing Caesarion, her court, her wealth. She lived in a villa across the Tiber, technically outside the city walls, but her presence was impossible to ignore. Romans were scandalized and fascinated in equal measure. Here was a foreign queen, draped in silk and gold, speaking perfect Latin, hosting philosophers and politicians. Caesar had her statue erected in the Temple of Venus. Rumors spread that he would divorce his Roman wife, make Cleopatra his queen, move Rome's capital to Alexandria. The Senate watched with growing alarm. And then came the Ides of March, 44 BCE. Caesar was stabbed 23 times on the Senate floor beneath a statue of Pompey, the very man he had chased to Egypt. The dream of unity, of a joined empire, died with him in the dust. Cleopatra, suddenly vulnerable, fled Rome with her son and returned to Egypt. Caesar's will named his great-nephew Octavian as heir, not Caesarion. The boy who might have ruled both worlds was cast aside by Roman law. But Rome itself descended into chaos. Caesar's assassins fled. His supporters sought revenge. And from the ashes of civil war, 3 men emerged to divide the Roman world between them. Octavian, young and ruthless, Lepidus, weak and soon sidelined, and Mark Antony, bold, charismatic, and hungry for glory. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, knew that Egypt's survival depended on choosing the right ally. When Mark Antony summoned her to meet him in Tarsus in 41 BCE, she did not simply arrive. She orchestrated an entrance for the ages. She came by river on a golden barge, its sails dyed purple, its oars tipped with silver. Music floated across the water. She reclined beneath a canopy of gold, dressed as the goddess Isis, attended by boys dressed as cupids and girls as sea nymphs. The barge was perfumed with incense. It was theater. It was myth. It was calculated seduction not of the man, but of the moment. Antony was dazzled. Where Caesar had been cold and calculating, Antony was warm and passionate, a man who loved wine, women, spectacle, and glory in equal measure. He and Cleopatra became lovers, partners, co-conspirators, in a dream of shared empire. She gave him twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, named for the sun and moon. He gave her territories, Roman lands returned to Egyptian control, a restoration of the empire Alexander had once promised. Together, they ruled the eastern Mediterranean from Alexandria, that glittering city that had become the center of their world. In 34 BCE, Antony held a ceremony called the Donations of Alexandria. Before a massive crowd, he declared Cleopatra the Queen of Kings, Caesarion the rightful heir to Caesar's legacy, and their children rulers of vast territories. It was magnificent. It was provocative. And in Rome, it was seen as treason. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, watched from across the sea with cold fury. He had been consolidating power in Rome, playing the role of defender of tradition while Antony played emperor in the East. Octavian launched a propaganda war. He painted Antony as a man bewitched, unmanned by a foreign sorceress, a Roman general who had abandoned his people for Egyptian gold and a seductive queen. He painted Cleopatra as a threat to Rome itself, a scheming temptress bent on destroying Roman virtue. The truth was more complicated, but Octavian understood that truth was less important than the story people believed. War became inevitable. In 31 BCE, the forces of Antony and Cleopatra met Octavian's fleet at Actium, off the western coast of Greece. It was a naval battle, hundreds of ships clashing in the blue Mediterranean waters, the fate of empires hanging in the balance. But the battle turned quickly. Cleopatra, seeing her ships outmaneuvered, withdrew her fleet and sailed for Egypt. Antony, whether out of love or strategy or desperation, abandoned his own forces and followed her. His fleet collapsed without him. The war was over before it had truly begun. They returned to Alexandria, not as conquerors but as the condemned. They knew Octavian was coming. They knew what awaited them. For a few final months, they held court, threw feasts, lived as if the world had not already ended. They called themselves the Order of the Inseparable in Death, a dark echo of their earlier grandeur. And then Octavian's forces arrived at Egypt's borders. Antony, hearing false rumors that Cleopatra had already killed herself, fell on his own sword. He did not die immediately. Wounded, bleeding, he was carried to where Cleopatra had locked herself in her mausoleum, surrounded by treasure, incense, and fading hope. She pulled him up through a window, held him as he died in her arms. The man who had loved her, fought for her, lost everything for her, breathed his last in her embrace. Days later, Octavian entered Alexandria. There was no battle, no siege. The city simply surrendered. Egypt was finished as an independent kingdom. It would become a Roman province, a breadbasket to feed the empire, its wealth flowing not to pharaohs but to Roman coffers. Cleopatra was brought before Octavian. He did not look at her as Caesar had with fascination, or as Antony had with passion. He saw only a problem to be solved, a loose end to tie up, a symbol to parade through Rome in chains. But Cleopatra would not be paraded. She was 39 years old, the last of the Ptolemies, the last pharaoh of Egypt. She had survived exile, civil war, assassination plots, and political intrigue. She had loved two of Rome's greatest men and borne their children. She had ruled Egypt for over 20 years. She would not end her story as Octavian's trophy. In her private chambers, guarded but not quite imprisoned, she prepared for death as if it were a sacred ritual. The story, repeated through centuries, says she used an asp, a small venomous snake hidden in a basket of figs, a creature sacred to Egyptian gods. Some say poison, some say a hairpin dipped in venom. The truth is lost to history. What we know is that she died on her own terms, dressed in royal regalia, lying on a golden couch. Her two most loyal handmaidens died with her, 3 women lying in stillness as the world shifted outside their door. When Octavian's guards discovered her, it was too late. Cleopatra was gone. The last breath of an empire 3,000 years old had been exhaled. Octavian had her son Caesarion hunted down and executed. No more heirs, no more threats, no more Egypt. The temples would continue for a time. The priests would chant. The Nile would flood. But the crown was gone. Egypt became a province, ruled by Roman governors, its grain shipped to feed Roman mouths, its gold mined for Roman coffers, its identity slowly absorbed into the machinery of empire. But Cleopatra did not vanish quietly into history. Her story was seized, reshaped, weaponized. Octavian, soon to become Augustus, the first Roman emperor, needed her to be a villain. His propagandists painted her as a seductress, a foreign temptress who had corrupted noble Roman men, the reason Antony had fallen, the embodiment of Eastern decadence threatening Roman virtue. For generations, Roman historians would repeat this version, turning a brilliant, multilingual, politically astute queen into a cautionary tale about the dangers of female power and foreign influence. And yet, she refused to die. Her legend grew. In Egypt, she was remembered not as a villain, but as the last defender of their independence, the final pharaoh who had spoken their language, honored their gods, and fought to preserve their ancient civilization. Artists painted her. Playwrights wrote her. Shakespeare gave her immortal words. Hollywood made her a goddess in eyeliner and gold, her voice echoing through cinema, her image crystallized in collective imagination. Today, we search for her tomb. Somewhere beneath Egyptian sand or Mediterranean water lies the final resting place of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, buried together as she had wished. Archaeologists dig, theorize, hope. But she remains hidden, just as she remains elusive in history itself, obscured by myth and propaganda, by the stories men told about her, by the legends she herself helped create. What we can say with certainty is this: Cleopatra was not simply beautiful, though she may have been. She was brilliant, speaking 9 languages, studying astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. She was not simply seductive, though she understood the power of presentation. She was strategic, navigating a world dominated by men with intelligence and calculated boldness. She was not simply a victim of Roman conquest. She was a ruler who fought to preserve her kingdom's independence for over 2 decades in an era when Egypt had become a prize coveted by the world's rising superpower. She ruled in a time of impossible choices, standing between the old world of pharaohs and temples and the new world of Roman legions and republican politics. She walked the line between Egyptian tradition and Greek culture, between divine mythology and practical statecraft. She bore children to Rome's most powerful men, not out of helplessness, but as strategic alliances meant to secure Egypt's future. She lost, yes, but she played the game with skill and daring until the very end. When Cleopatra died, an entire era died with her. The age of pharaohs, of divine kingship, of Egypt as an independent power, ended that day in Alexandria. The temples would stand for centuries more, slowly crumbling, their priests eventually forbidden to worship the old gods as Christianity spread through the empire. The hieroglyphs would fall silent, their meaning lost for over 1,000 years, until the Rosetta Stone unlocked their secrets once more. The Ptolemaic dynasty, that odd fusion of Greek blood and Egyptian crown, ended not with glory, but with tragedy. 3 bodies lying still while Rome celebrated outside. But in that ending, there was also a kind of triumph. Cleopatra chose her own death, wrote her own final chapter, refused to be led in chains through Roman streets as a conquered barbarian. She died as she had lived, on her own terms, dressed as a goddess, surrounded by the symbols of her power. In a world that tried to reduce her to ornament or cautionary tale, she insisted on being remembered as a queen. And we do remember her. 20 centuries later, we still speak her name. We still tell her story. We still wonder about the woman behind the myth, the queen who spoke 9 languages, who negotiated with emperors, who ruled the richest kingdom in the ancient world, who loved and lost and fought until the very end. History tried to bury her beneath propaganda and legend, but she keeps rising, keeps fascinating, keeps demanding that we look beyond the simplified stories to the complicated truth beneath. So, dear listener, as we close this chapter, remember Cleopatra not just as the queen who loved Caesar and Antony, though she did, not just as the last pharaoh, though she was, not just as the beautiful seductress of Roman propaganda, though they painted her that way. Remember her as a survivor, a strategist, a scholar, and a ruler who fought to preserve her kingdom in an age of empires. Remember her standing in temple halls speaking ancient prayers, signing treaties in multiple languages, holding her dying lover in her arms, and choosing death over defeat. She was the last light of a civilization 3,000 years old, and when that light went out, the world was never quite the same. Thank you for listening. Thank you for journeying with me back through time to walk beside one of history's most fascinating figures. May her story linger with you, and may the past continue to illuminate the present. Until next time, farewell.